subject of our final session is key Maritime Asia, and that, for purposes of this discussion, is three places: the East China Sea and South China Sea, and then the Indian Ocean, which is a new topic to introduce to Washington conversations. Our speakers are all very well informed about this. I won't take time to give long introductions. Bonnie Glaser. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. Bonnie Glaser will lead off, and she's a Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the China Power Project at CSIS. Wu Xinbo, we've already heard from. He's doing double duty, and we appreciate that. Sinderpal Singh is a Senior Fellow in the Southeast Asia Program at the Rajaratnam School. And Sheila Smith is a good friend of all of us. She's Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. So we'll ask Bonnie to start off.
Well, thank you, Richard, and I'm sorry that I've missed the opportunity to benefit from the discussions earlier today. And I will just try to talk quickly and say a few general things, since I know we have a very short panel and probably want to have some time for discussion. So I thought just what I would do is show some slides about how people, I think, here are generally thinking about China's role in Maritime Asia, some of the activities that China is engaged in. And I start with various sources of instability. The operation of maritime law enforcement vessels, coast guards, other constabulary forces, the island building, land reclamation, the militarization of the land features in the Spratlys, some of the challenges to freedom of navigation that we've seen, and some of the practices that are incompatible potentially with the Convention on Law of the Sea. So for any of you who have not looked at my China Power project, it's chinapower.csis.org. One of the things that we've done on this particular issue is to put together a data set of what all of the countries in the region who have significant coast guards, what kind of activities we've seen based on open source data, obviously, identifying what we define as major incidents that took place between 2010 and 2016. And we found that China was involved in 72% of these incidents. And we have a card on every incident which identifies, where possible, the hull numbers of the ships involved, the type of activity that was used. In this case, it's a China maritime incident with harassment and ramming. So this is an ongoing problem. Yes, we of course should pay attention to the activities of navies. We have the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea that provides some procedures for navies to avoid collision and to communicate, but we don't have anything comparable with maritime law enforcement agencies. This is something actually the U.S. and China have been talking about, but we haven't yet reached any conclusion or made progress. And then, of course, there's the activity, and this is from the Japanese Coast Guard, about ongoing incursions by China inside the 12 nautical miles around the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which, of course, really got going after 2012, when the Japanese purchased in September of that year 3 of those islands, the government from private individuals. And this ongoing activity is a source of instability, I believe, as well. This is on the issue of the island building. This is a picture of the initial construction at Fiery Cross in 2010. It's a very small feature, and a very small construction or building. And then you can see in the next slide the original facility on the extreme side over there is that tiny area. And so this is what China, of course, has built. At the top is the 3,000-foot airstrip. China now has 3 of those on Subi Reef and Mischief Reef. China was the last claimant to have substantial airstrips in the region. There's no doubt about that. And then I'll talk in a minute about some of the militarization going on. Yes, other countries have reclaimed land in the Spratlys, but I think you can see from this particular slide how imbalanced that land reclamation has been. The vast majority of it has been done by China. And China's government often says that it doesn't challenge freedom of navigation. This is in part because of our different definitions of what is allowable under the Convention and the Law of the Sea. But I wanted to point out some of the things that the U.S. Military is doing, and there was just recently a report released on our freedom of navigation operations for the private year that shows what we were challenging. So we're challenging China's claim to excessive strait baselines. The last FONOP that we did in October challenged the strait baselines that are around that are in the paracels. There are 28 base points. They're connected by strait baselines. There's airspace jurisdiction over the exclusive economic zone that China often prevents freedom of navigation or freedom of flight in restricting foreign flight through an air defense identification zone. There was just an incident about 24 hours ago where China claims that the U.S. aircraft, I think a bomber, was flying in a way that was against international law. So we have a different interpretation of that. And of course, China says there should be prior permission required before foreign military go through the territorial sea, even in innocent passage. And we've seen the Chinese Navy, or heard the Chinese Navy talk about the U.S. entering the military alert zone, which is a phrase that doesn't exist under the Convention, the Law of the Sea. So from the U.S. perspective, there is some challenge to freedom of navigation. And then there's this draft maritime safety law that's being discussed in China. These deliberations are ongoing. This would be an update to the 1982 maritime safety law. And there are some provisions in that law that could potentially run contrary to UNCLOS, but we have to see particularly not only the wording, but whether there is an enforcement mechanism. So I would highlight, for example, the reference to, in the third bullet, China's jurisdictional waters and the right of hot pursuit against foreign vessels. So jurisdictional waters is something that we're unclear about what China declares jurisdiction over, whether this encompasses the entire 9-dash line, for examples. And I'm not going to go into detail, but there's a very interesting ongoing discussion among experts and lawyers about this new maritime safety law, and it is still in consultation, so it's not completed yet. And then I wanted to say some things on the positive side of the ledger, some of the things that China is doing to contribute to maritime stability and may have the potential to make greater contributions in the future. One is going all the way back, of course, the agreements between China and Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin regarding fisheries and the maritime boundary delimitation, the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in 2002, the agreement between China and Japan in 2008 on developing natural resources, which is pretty much now defunct. China-ASEAN Maritime Cooperation Fund, China's participation in ADM and Plus exercises. I already referred to queues and plan ships implementing queues. There's the bilateral U.S.-China Memorandum of Understanding on rules of behavior for safety in air and maritime encounters. And then finally, there is a plan to have Coast Guard exercises between China and the Philippines. There, of course, is an ongoing discussion about the code of conduct between China and ASEAN. That, I think, stands in the future going forward as an opportunity to not only identify some confidence-building measures, but perhaps also to have a legally binding mechanism, which the declaration was not, and to have a dispute settlement mechanism. And that could help potentially to deal with what I highlighted initially is the destabilizing behavior of maritime law enforcement vessels. So I will just close by saying that I think that these are all challenges for the Trump administration going forward. I don't yet see any clear new policy on these maritime issues. We have seen a reiteration of, for example, the Senkakus being under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So I see a lot of continuity in our statements regarding the East China Sea. I think the South China Sea, I've seen a lot of contradictory statements, and there is some discussion of the possibility of a policy review on those issues, but I think we have yet to see how the Trump administration is going to handle South China Sea. We should keep in mind that Xi Jinping, when he was here for the last summit, did make a statement in the Rose Garden next to then President Obama that China doesn't have the intention to militarize the Spratlys. That's something that appears to be going forward in any case. But we do need to have, I think, a conversation not just among the claimants, but also between other actors in the region about steps that could be taken that will prevent what I see as a sort of slippery slope towards a potential crisis in the South China Sea if there is ongoing militarization, because I think we're likely to see a much stronger reaction from this administration than from the last one. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie, very much. A very crisp, content-rich presentation and disciplined use of time. So if I could invite Shinbo and Cinderpal to come on up. We'll go ahead. I think Shinbo is next on the list. Wait.
Well, Bonnie just presented quite official U.S. position on the South China Sea and East China Sea issue. Let me try to present a kind of personal and a scholar's view on these issues. For East China Sea, Diaoyu Island dispute between China and Japan, I think the situation has largely stabilized over the last several years. Of course, this is still a very dynamic situation and is evolving. We can have two choices. One is to maintain a negative status quo in East China Sea between China and Japan over Diaoyu Island. The bottom line, of course, is to avoid conflict, incidental conflict. How to get there? One, of course, neither side will escalate the actions and reactions. For example, do not send people, military or civilian, to the Diaoyu Islands, and also refrain from conducting military exercises in the adjacent water of Diaoyu Islands. And two, China and Japan should establish a good crisis management mechanism, not only between the law enforcement and military authority, but also between the two foreign ministries, so that we can maintain good communication. And even more importantly, on each side, we should make sure that the internal control is effective, so that neither side will see some unauthorized provocative actions, which may escalate to a crisis. So this is what I call as a negative status quo. It is negative because you don't really have agreement on how to manage the disputes. So for positive status quo is we should agree to rephrase the sovereign disputes infinitely. So we used to have this kind of understanding, but it was broken in 2012 when Japan decided to nationalize airlines. Any chance for us to get back to that kind of agreement? And two, even further, whether the two sides can stop the patrol activities within the 12 nautical miles of Diaoyu Islands. Neither side will do that. And at the same time, of course, we should continue to negotiate and implement the agreement over fishery, as we did in the past. So this is some kind of thinking about how to manage the East China Sea issue. For South China Sea, I think we are very close to establishing a new framework on this issue through multilateral and bilateral efforts. Multilaterally, the ongoing negotiation over code of conduct in South China Sea will help establish the common rules, and the common rules will prevent each side from taking actions to aggravate the situation. So if by middle of this year, June, July, the agreement framework for the COC can be reached, then we are taking a major step forward in that direction. And bilateral efforts will involve more actions. We should put these disputes in broad context of bilateral relations: China-Philippines, China-Malaysia, China-Vietnam. We should not allow the entire relationship to be hijacked by these issues. These issues have been there for decades, and they may remain so in the future. And bilateral relations have to move forward. And especially if we can develop the bilateral relations, then the importance of those disputes will decline. Of course, at the same time, we should also give priority to some kind of arrangement about fishing in the disputed area. I think fishing is a difficult issue because it really involves the concrete interests of the local governments and the local people. But politically, it's less sensitive than sovereign disputes. I think China, Japan, China, Vietnam, China, Philippines used to have similar arrangements. We should encourage them. And finally, to negotiate the crisis management approaches in the bilateral context. And also, as a matter of both multilateral and bilateral effort, one thing I would propose that for all the related parties, they will make the use of those islands under their control, islands, reefs, islands under their control for civilian purpose as much as possible, like fishery, you providing shelter facilities for fishing boats and fishermen, facilitating scientific research, providing convenience for humanitarian assistance, and finally, to provide convenience for navigation, like the lighthouse building on those islands and reefs. So these are some of the ideas about I think we can do in the future in both bilateral and multilateral context. I understand on this issue the outsiders, U.S. and Japan, not direct claimant, but also have been deeply involved over the last several years, especially the United States, under the excuse of freedom of navigation. Let's be frank enough. Freedom of navigation has not been challenged. The U.S. concern is pretty much related to the geopolitical consideration in South China Sea. And even this issue can also be discussed in China-U.S. Bilateral dialogue. I think when Secretary Kerry came to Beijing telling our leaders, okay, China is not the first country to do the island construction. But the problem for China is you did it too fast. You did it too big. Well, the question is, tell me how big and how fast is appropriate. Do we have any international legal framework in judging the action of China, whether it's appropriate or not? Maybe it's just because China did it, so it's not acceptable to the U.S. anyway. When the U.S. expressed a concern of militarization, I would say it's partially justifiable because we don't want to see the over militarization of South China Sea. No need to do that. However, some kind of defense deployments on those small islands doesn't really make a difference of strategic picture. Think about 5 or 10 years from now, when China deploy 1 or 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in South China Sea. Are they more meaningful than the current small islands with some limited defense weapon systems? Then will U.S. oppose China's deployment of aircraft carrier battle groups? It may, but it cannot stop China from doing this. So I think for these kind of things, you really need some strategic thinking and also encourage real multilateral efforts, which will decide what kind of action is okay, what kind of action is inappropriate, and what kind of action is should be prohibited. So only within this context, then all the sides can have the same standard and same role governing their actions. Again, compared to 1 year ago, now I feel quite comfortable with the current situation in South China Sea. I think it's moving in the right direction. After all, this issue has to be managed and resolved among the direct claimants and also between China and the 10 South Asian countries. So that's exactly what Minister Wang Yi proposed, dual-track approach. But outsiders like the U.S. and Japan can play a role. This role can be either productive or counterproductive. So if we can really have this kind of vision about what kind of South China Sea we want to see in the future, I think we should encourage the current efforts. With that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very articulately stated, even though you're probably jet-lagged. Cinderpaul?
Thank you, Richard. My brief today is to speak to the topic of Southeast Asia's views about Indian Ocean security. So mine is not going to be as exciting as the earlier two presentations. So I apologize for that beforehand. I just want to make 3 main points. The first is, why am I talking about this topic? Right, 15, 20 years ago, this notion of Southeast Asia being interested in the Indian Ocean is a non-topic, right? The Indian Ocean was a separate strategic space. The Western Pacific and the Pacific was a separate strategic space. But something or some things have happened. And I argue that 2 major things have happened. One is the notion among Southeast Asian states that you need to enmesh India into the East Asian security architecture, right? That's one. And because you need to do that, you need to show that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is one single strategic space, right? That's the first move. The second reason is China's increasing presence in the Indian Ocean, because whether legitimate or not legitimate, notion of the Malacca dilemma, right? So we see this happening in the Indian Ocean. And as a result, we see this increasing strategic competition between India and China in the Indian Ocean. So from the view of Southeast Asian states, and I stick my neck out and say maybe ASEAN, given what we heard about ASEAN yesterday, the notion here that maybe ASEAN now can punch, to use another cliche, punch above its weight. It started off with managing great power relations in Southeast Asia. It moved on to managing great power relations in East Asia. Hey, why can't we do the larger stage? Why can't we do the Indian Ocean as well? And therefore, this term that we discussed briefly yesterday, the Indo-Pacific, becomes something that everyone wants to talk about. Not everyone. I think our Chinese friends are not very sure about this term, but we can talk about that later. So that's just setting the stage, right? The stage about why Southeast Asia wants to talk about the Indian Ocean and how it fits into the Southeast Asian view of the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic space. My second point is more specific about Indonesia. More recently, we've seen, especially under President Jokowi's government, that Indonesia has started to articulate a bigger role for itself, right? Indonesia is talking about how ASEAN is too small for Indonesia. I mean, Rizal Sukma, who will be known to some people here, who has spoken about how ASEAN is not an end goal for Indonesia. Indonesia is a great power, right? A global maritime power. So it needs to find a bigger space for itself. And then once you start with that argument, then it becomes quite logical to see the Indian Ocean as a space for Indonesia to play a key role, given its geographic location. If you have a map, you can see that Indonesia is located right in the middle of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So Indonesia's idea of playing a major maritime role, and then you hear this is term that they've used, global maritime fulcrum, I think. There's some issues about translating from Bahasa Indonesia to English, but we can get into that later on. So this is the kind of Indonesia's, under Jokowi's notion that Indonesia should play a larger role, right? Some people say that this is not because Indonesia thinks that ASEAN is too small for it. Some people say that the reason why Indonesia wants to play a role in the Indian Ocean is because it realizes that ASEAN isn't working, right? ASEAN is broke. So should we go and look somewhere else to play a role that is fitting for a big country, a great power like Indonesia? And that's another reason why Indonesia was one of the earliest and I think keenest articulators of this notion of the Indo-Pacific. Of course, the Japanese were also very keen, the Australians and the Americans. So that's the Indonesian side of how it views the Indian Ocean, right? My third point is, this is all very nice and good. There's the Southeast Asian vision, the Indonesian vision, but what are the shortcomings? Why haven't we seen in practice what has been articulated both by Southeast Asian states and by Indonesia? Indonesia specifically, I think Stanley Roth talked about it yesterday. Jokowi is very preoccupied with what's going on domestically. He's fighting political battles on a daily basis, trying to fulfill domestic promises that he's made. I mean, those who are following the Jakarta governor election will realize that Jokowi is really bogged down domestically. So this affected his attention span on foreign policy. Number two is, this is, I call, not only the Indonesian problem, but the ASEAN problem. And it's very apparent from my predecessors, the both of them who spoke, is that the Indian Ocean is still far away. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, is still the priority area for Southeast Asian states. And you can't escape yourself because there's geography, right? Also, it is where tensions are highest, right? And in the Indian Ocean, although people speak about rising tensions or rising strategic competition between India and China, it is still a relatively peaceful place, right? The main threats are non-traditional in nature: piracy, HADR, maybe some idea of fisheries management, and even piracy over the last, let's say, 6-7 years from its peak has started to go down, right? So there are no real and present threats in the Indian Ocean to force Southeast Asian governments to take a bigger interest in it. Third, I'm going to make a controversial point, and just to make things exciting. I think that there is some amount of ambivalence on Indonesia's part about the role that India should play in the Western Pacific. If you look at the range of attitudes among ASEAN states about what role India should play, Indonesia doesn't come to the fore in terms of ASEAN countries who want India to play a strong role, right? Singapore will be up there, more and more Vietnam. Thailand, we're not too sure, regime change. Malaysia, not too sure. But Indonesia, especially, I think, there's been a disquiet about what they want India to do in the Western Pacific. And this, again, I think is a problem. I'm just going to sum up now. I think the other problem with Indonesia playing this role, they said, the role about Indonesia as an honest broker in the Indo-Pacific, managing great power relations between India and China, India, China, US, is exactly related to the point I made earlier. It's ambivalence towards India, and it's relatively good relationship with China, with some blips. But generally, the economic, strategic relationship with China has been quite good. So if you are an Indian sitting in Delhi, you ask yourself this question: is Indonesia going to be an honest broker when it comes to rising strategic tensions in the Indian Ocean? Difficult to answer that question. And the second, I think, issue is, when viewed from Southeast Asia, there's a lot of angst about India not doing enough in East Asia, in Southeast Asia. And I can talk about the Indian situation later on, but I think the Indian, firstly, the economic outreach hardly matches what China has done in the region, right? In terms of Indian naval projection, naval capability, east of the Indian Ocean, we're talking about Western Pacific, most people understand it is far from being a key naval power in the Western Pacific. So if you're a Southeast Asian state, you ask yourself a question: is India a partner that you want to rely on in case things go wrong in the Western Pacific? Sadly, the answer would be no. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting and new perspective for a Washington audience. And last but not least, Sheila Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be with such wonderful colleagues up on the panel. So my job, of course, is to end the panel, so I'll try to be very brief. Two things to talk about, I think, in terms of U.S., Japan, China cooperation. The first is what's happening in the East China Sea, both the territorial tensions as well as the maritime boundary tensions in the East China Sea. And then second is this broader question, which a number of speakers have raised already, which is open sea lanes and this question of maritime stability or maritime security in the Asia-Pacific. So the U.S. and Japan have a fairly robust dialogue, of course, on these maritime issues, and the alliance has been adapted fairly significantly, I think, to respond to the 2010 and then the 2012 change in the status quo there. There's increasing interactions today across the East China Sea by Japanese and Chinese law enforcement vessels, naval vessels, and aircraft, military aircraft as well now, and that we should have cause to be concerned about. There's heightened risk. In the old days, before 2010, the heightened risk used to be of citizens, activists and fishermen getting in the way, and then the governments would have to try to regulate that. Whereas today, I think that's largely moved up the scale a little bit to both Coast Guard and now military interactions. The Self-Defense Force, as many people know here, are a highly professional military, but there is incidents and probing by the PLAN and the PLAF that I think has tested in some ways some of the principles, some of the rules of engagement that the Japanese have long maintained on their military. I think the fast answer in terms of the political conversation between Beijing and Tokyo today is they've lost the capacity for managing the problem. It is now a space that Tokyo turns to the United States to help with deterrence as well as with crisis management, given the uptick in the military engagement by China in the region. The Japanese and Chinese have, in fact, tried to initiate a risk reduction agreement that would help their militaries be more certain about the predictability of the interactions. You'll remember when Prime Minister Abe and President Xi met in November of 2014, they identified the risk of this military interaction as one of their priorities, and they began a conversation on risk reduction. To date, we have not seen the conclusion of that conversation, and there are many arguments as to why, but until we actually see both governments understanding and issuing their understanding of what would be provocative behavior, we're still in this middle ground, I think, that's very hard to manage. The U.S.-Japan alliance, as I said, has responded to Japanese concerns and to this element of unpredictability. I think nobody believes that Beijing or Tokyo want a conflict across the East China Sea. But again, until there's more regulatory behavior at the political level, it's going to be primarily a deterrent challenge. So the U.S. governments have iterated at the highest levels, President Obama first, but then more recently, as Bonnie noted, President Trump have declared the Article 5 protections extend to territory under the administrative control of Japan. We've had deployments and exercises. The Japanese have sought to up their capabilities in amphibious landing. We have had rotational deployments of U.S. forces in and through the bases in Okinawa. And we've had increased Japanese capabilities and information sharing in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So you're looking at the two militaries and the two governments, making sure that they see the same operational picture, and that's an important piece of the alliance adjustment. The other piece I think is equally important is the political piece. The U.S. and Japan upgraded their defense cooperation guidelines in 2015, and they created an alliance coordination mechanism. And this is designed to make sure that both governments are fully engaged should there be a crisis or an emerging crisis, that both Tokyo and Washington will be able to manage the situation in such a way as to preclude that rising to the level of a military conflict. This is not designed to plan for war, it's designed to avoid it. And so the alliance now has a very preliminary effort at crisis management, but one that I think has already been put to use, frankly, in the North Korean missile launches very effectively. So let me shift now from the East China Sea to this larger and more difficult question that the previous speakers have addressed so well, the maritime security conversation in the Asia-Pacific. Japan is a maritime power. It depends on access to not only energy from the Gulf and the Middle East, but also to trade and the open and free sea lanes across the Indo-Pacific. Japan has assumed and is continuing to implement a growing role in security, maritime security cooperation. It has helped the Philippines and now Vietnam with building capacities, maritime capacities that will help strengthen their ability to manage their own waters. It is also, with the United States, expanding its role in exercises, the Malabar exercises with India, and more recently the Balikatan exercises, hopefully starting this year with the Philippines. So there's continued close strategic cooperation, of course, with Australia. Tokyo is worried about the South China Sea. And so we can argue about whether Tokyo has a right to worry or not, but Tokyo has an interest in open and free navigation. The East China Sea and the South China Sea are not decoupled in any way for the Japanese, and you have just seen Japan announce that the Izumo, its largest destroyer, will be partnering with others and conducting port visits in and around the South China Sea. So what China does there, what other countries do there, it matters to Japan. And I don't see a combat role or a war planning role for Japan, but I certainly see a dialogue between Japan and other maritime partners in the region. Let me conclude very quickly with 3 points about where are we today and if President Trump and his staff were sitting in the room, what I'd like to say to them. Good luck. So I do think, and Bonnie pointed this out, and I'll just restate it here, you've seen remarkable continuity on the East China Sea, and I think you saw very early when Prime Minister Abe came to town, the repeat of the commitment of the United States to Article 5 protections for the islands there. What I think we need to continue to work closely on is the uptick in Chinese exercises in and around Japanese waters. Clearly, the tweet storm on the One China policy also was simultaneously reflected in the activities of the Chinese military, both through the Bashi Straits, but also through the Okinawan Straits. There's a higher level of Chinese military activity. And again, as Bonnie noted, in the ADIZ, the Chinese apparently have become more assertive about enforcement of that. Second, there's a lack of progress, as I say again, on the risk reduction dialogue between Beijing and Tokyo. I can't overemphasize the fact that this needs to move forward and that you have to have high-level political support to make sure that it does so. I think Chinese sensitivities have been very high on Japanese statements of interest, for example, on the UNCLOS tribunal, on other issues, South China Sea related. There's been a fairly high-level Chinese disparagement of Japanese interest in maritime security, and I don't think that helps. I think, in fact, it hinders broader regional cooperation. Finally, this issue of linkage between East China Sea and South China Sea, I think we should be careful that we don't underestimate the way in which the Beijing looks at both of these seas and the way in which pressures in one sea may redound quietly to increase pressures in the other. I think the militaries of the region certainly are aware of this, but I think we should think about a broader regional architecture that is not South China Sea specific, or in fact even ASEAN specific. If I had the best possible outcome here, I would love to see an Asia-Pacific code of conduct, not only about territorial disputes, but also about the management of maritime boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have time for a few questions before we have to close and give up the room. So I think what I'd like to do is take three and pitch them to the audience, see who wants to respond. I see Isuk Jung and gentleman on the aisle, one more person at the back. So let's start with Isuk Jung up here. There you go.
I was a little surprised because no panelist has mentioned about the permanent court of arbitration ruling of last year. So it is international law is dead here, and I particularly like to ask about this PCA's ruling effect upon Chinese behavior. It seems like this ruling didn't prevent anything, from China's more aggressive behavior in South China Sea. And I even hear that China is thinking about creating their own version of multilateral rules in this maritime disputes. So I wonder how that goal is progressing in among the Chinese the security experts.
Halfway back on the aisle.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask about South China Sea. I totally understand that U.S. professionals are concerning about some accident with China, but on the other hand, China is taking advantage of that fear, and while the Obama administration was avoiding to send the warship to near islands in South China Sea, China proceeded to land reclamation furthermore. So how do we avoid that kind of Chinese strategy, salami slicing strategy? And I would like also ask about, do you think that Japanese effort in order to maintain peace and stability in South China Sea is enough regarding with Japanese economic size?
Yu Dong-hui in the back.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is for Bonnie and Xinbo. Will the South China Sea issue be the front burner issue, or will take the back seat in the upcoming summit? What kind of reassurance to each other can we expect from this summit in this regard? Thank you.
Bonnie and Xinbo, I think that question and also the arbitral tribunal is best directed at the two of you.
No, I think this time I'll respond to you.
Okay. You will shoot back, right? Well, I think on the ruling of International Arbitration Court, basically, if you take a look at the UNCLOS, the signatories have the right to decide whether or not you make exceptions for whether, when it comes to sovereignty issues, you will accept the ruling. So China, as early as in 2006, has already announced that when it comes to maritime, territorial, and sovereignty disputes, we will not accept the UNCLOS in that case. So it's not just, Philippines launches this, China decided to not accept it. It's a general principle. So that's exactly the right you have as a member of the UNCLOS. So since China didn't participate, and since China already announced to not accept this, so I don't think that ruling has any impact on China's behavior. So I think that's quite understandable. Having said that, as already mentioned, I think since last year, the situation in South China Sea has been, cooling down because of the efforts by the related parties. Especially, I should give some credit to the new president in Philippines, and he decided Philippines should adjust its approach to this issue, and it seems to be working. Yes. Pardon.
So in the ruling, I had actually several slides, but I took them out because of the time constraint. I think that the ruling remains important right now. It is in the background. I think, I talked to many people from China who believe that the ruling, even though it very much went in the direction that they didn't want, has had an impact on thinking in China about international law, even about the possibility of reacting differently and maybe even participating in third-party dispute mediation in the future, whether it be through arbitral panel, ICJ, or other formulations. I think the problem now is that, it's hard for the United States to want to implement this ruling more than the Philippines. After all, it was only binding on the Philippines and China. And we do have a new president who has not rejected the ruling, but has said he's putting this on the back seat, and he says before the end of his term that he will raise it. I think that this is not something that I would completely dismiss. In response to the question on the upcoming Trump-Xi meeting, I think North Korea is seen as a more urgent issue for the United States and China. But Secretary Tillerson did raise South China Sea when he was in Beijing. I don't know whether President Trump will raise it, but it's not seen right now as urgent. In the run-up to the 19-party Congress, I don't think that there's expectations that China's going to do anything that is really destabilizing, and so it really isn't seen as urgent. Finally, I just want to comment on something that Xinbo said earlier. I think it would be a mischaracterization that the only concern that the U.S. has is because China built too far or too much too fast. There are military implications for the capabilities that China is deploying in the South China Sea in the form of radar, surface-to-air missiles on each one of these features 24 hardened aircraft shelters. And I guess I would urge you to talk to the PLA about how those capabilities could be used in a crisis, and you might better understand why the United States is concerned. And maybe this is just part of the ongoing problem of the stovepiping between the scholars and the military in China. Thank you.
Sheila, there were a couple of Japan-focused questions. You want to address
So I got
those?
one, maybe did I miss one? So I wanted to talk about the U.S. response in the South China Sea, and I understand from the tone of the question that it reflects what some in Tokyo think was an insufficient American response during the Obama administration. So let's just be clear. I think that's what you were alluding to, the freedom of navigation. Is that right? I learned my maritime issues from people like Mike McDevitt and others, and Mike is always very keen to remind us that freedom of navigation operations are diplomatic tools that we use to express when we agree or disagree with claims that are made, maritime claims that are made. I think there was care taken during the Obama administration to make sure that the communication was very clear about intent. And that there was a lot of kind of terms that were used there occasionally by policymakers that were not so clear and not so specific. I think we have done what we do with many countries around the globe. We demonstrate where we don't accept the baselines and the extended claims that emanate from them. On what can we do about the South China Sea, it's a very important topic, not just for the United States, but for others around the region, right? We don't have a direct claim. The powers that do have a direct claim don't have the same capability, military especially, that the Chinese have. I think you see a re-engagement by China with the ASEAN on the Code of Conduct, largely thanks to the tribunal last year. I think the Philippines broke new ground in using international law and the UN Law of the Sea to express its concerns and to elevate the question of whether or not this is a regional concern or whether or not it's a challenge to international law and norms. And I think they successfully did that. Now it's incumbent upon, I think, China, the United States, the claimants, and others to continue to push forward on the need for a common understanding of what's acceptable and what is really not. So I don't think, and some people argue, that the Trump administration, for example, Mr. Tillerson's comments during his confirmation hearings that the United States will not allow it, again, he changed his language. I don't think you're going to see the United States take military action to try to halt island building, but I think you're still going to see, and I'll defer to my China expert to my right here, but I still think you're going to see South China Sea be very high on our agenda of concern with Beijing. And as I said in my presentation, the United States will seek out other maritime partners. And yes, I think Japan, Australia, and India and other partners are very welcome in the effort to continue to demonstrate the need for open sea lanes. Thank you.
If I could just make a small comment in response to Donghui's comment and Bonnie's question and Bonnie's answer. I agree with Bonnie that right now this is not an urgent issue and that North Korea will be much higher on the agenda in the summit. However, it wouldn't hurt for the two leaders to try and have some sort of understanding at the summit on how to contain this, because if you don't have ways and means of keeping it on the back burner, it can swiftly move to the front burner, and then we're all in trouble. I think that we've run out of time for this panel and for our whole conference. I'm very pleased with the richness of the presentations and the conversation and the sharpness of the questions, and that's meant in a good way. And I want to thank some people again. First of all, the staff, not only Brookings, but of all the participating organizations who have made this possible. To all the presenters for their thoughtful presentations, particularly our participants who've come so far from the region to give voice to concerns in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia about the uncertainties that surround the new administration and its policies. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for staying with us for the whole time. and for participating so vigorously in our program. So thank you all very much. Yeah.